Tucked away in the rolling farmland southeast of Gettysburg, there lies a quiet stretch of ground that few visitors ever see. It's not marked by wide avenues or bustling tour buses. There are no paved roads leading to it, no gift shops nearby to sell you souvenirs. Officially, it's called Neill Avenue, but over the years it's earned other name, Lost Avenue. And for good reason. It's almost entirely surrounded by private property, hidden from the crowds that flock to Cemetery Hill or Little Round Top. To visit it today, you'll need permission from the landowners, who have graciously preserved this pristine piece of history. Neill Avenue is the least visited spot on the Gettysburg battlefield. It doesn't have the dramatic stories of Pickett's charge or the heroics of the 20th Maine at Little Round Top. But what it does have is something rare, a glimpse into a part of the battle that remains almost exactly as it was in July 1863. The stone walls still stand where Union and Confederate skirmishers exchanged fire. The woods and fields look much as they did when soldiers crouched behind rocks, wondering if they'd live to see another sunrise. This forgotten corner of Gettysburg was where Brigadier General Thomas Neill and his brigade of weary Union soldiers were sent to hold the Army's extreme right flank. Their job was simple in theory but critical in practice: protect the Baltimore Pike at all costs. If this road fell into Confederate hands, the entire Union Army could be outflanked or cut off from its lifeline. It was a job without glory, no grand charges or sweeping victories here, but one that had to be done. What happened on this remote stretch of ground might not make headlines in history books, but it mattered. The men who fought here, Mainers, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, knew that their small part in this massive battle could mean the difference between victory and defeat. They faced probing attacks from Confederate sharpshooters and skirmishers from Virginia and North Carolina clashing over stone walls and rocky hillsides. So if you ever find yourself at Gettysburg and want to see something different, something untouched by time, ask permission to visit Neill Avenue. Walk its quiet path and listen closely. You might just hear echoes of musket fire or catch a glimpse of soldiers crouched behind those ancient stone walls. Welcome to Lost Avenue, where history whispers instead of shouts. Now let me take you back to July 1863. The sun hung low in the July sky, its heat still clinging to the Pennsylvania hills like a stubborn mule. The men of Brigadier General Thomas Neill's brigade trudged along the dusty road, their boots kicking up clouds that seemed to settle in their lungs. The march had been long, too long for men already bone-tired from days of hard campaigning, but orders were orders, and they had been sent to secure the far right flank of the Union line. "Flank duty," grumbled Private Eli Baker of the 7th Maine, his musket slung over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. "Ain't that just another way of saying we're so far out they'll forget we're here?" "Quit your bellyaching, Baker," snapped Sergeant Nathaniel Carter, a grizzled veteran with a face like weathered leather. "If they forget we're here, that means Johnny Reb might too, and I'd rather be forgotten than dead." The brigade finally halted near a stone wall that snaked along the edge of a wooded slope. The officers barked orders to fortify the position, and the men set to work piling rocks and digging shallow trenches with whatever tools or hands they could muster. The wall offered some cover, but it wasn't much to look at. "Looks like this wall was built by a farmer with one arm and no sense," muttered Corporal Amos Reed of the 43rd New York as he hefted a rock into place. "Better than nothing," replied Carter, wiping sweat from his brow. "And if you got complaints, feel free to take 'em up with General Neill himself." Neill, perched on horseback nearby, was surveying the terrain with a stern expression that suggested he was not in the mood for complaints, or anything else short of miracles. The general was known as Old Reliable, and his men respected him for his steady leadership, even if they wished he'd occasionally order a break longer than 5 minutes. As dust began to settle over the hills, the first shots rang out from across Rock Creek. Confederate skirmishers were probing the Union line, testing its strength like wolves circling a herd of sheep. The crack of rifles echoed through the trees, and the men ducked behind their makeshift defenses. "Here they come!" someone shouted, though it was hard to see much through the thick foliage and gathering shadows. Eli Baker crouched low behind the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. This was his first real fight, and he wasn't sure whether he was more afraid of being shot or running away and earning himself a court-martial. And worse, Carter's scorn. "Steady now," Carter growled as he crouched beside Eli. "Don't go wasting your powder on shadows." The Confederates were out there somewhere, their movements masked by the trees and underbrush. Every now and then, a muzzle flash lit up the darkness, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. The Union soldiers returned fire sporadically, aiming more at sound than sight. Eli's hands trembled as he loaded his musket, fumbling with the percussion cap. He finally managed to get it in place and raised his weapon over the wall, squinting into the gloom. He thought he saw movement, a flash of gray, and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder like a mule's kick, and he nearly dropped the gun. "Good shot," Carter said dryly. "You might have scared a squirrel out of its tree." The skirmishing continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. The Confederates didn't press hard. They were feeling out the Union position rather than launching a full assault. Eventually, the firing tapered off, leaving an uneasy silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional groan from a wounded man. As darkness fell completely, Neill's officers gathered around him for orders while the men settled in for what promised to be an uncomfortable night. Some tried to sleep where they sat. Others kept watch along the wall, their eyes straining to pierce the blackness beyond Rock Creek. Eli sat with his back against the stones, cradling his musket in his lap. His hands still shook slightly from adrenaline and fear, or maybe it was just exhaustion. He couldn't tell anymore. "You did fine today," Carter said quietly as he sat down beside him. Eli looked up in surprise. "Didn't feel fine." "War never does," Carter replied with a shrug. "But you're still breathin', ain't you? That's more'n some can say." Eli nodded slowly and stared out into the dark woods where Confederate skirmishers lurked unseen. "Think they'll come again?" he asked. Carter snorted softly. "Oh, they'll come all right, maybe not tonight, but soon enough." He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. "And when they do," he added after a moment, "we'll be ready for 'em." Eli wasn't so sure about that, but for now, he was too tired to argue. The morning of July 3, 1863, dawned with a damp haze clinging to the fields and woods around Gettysburg. The men of Neill's brigade stirred from their uncomfortable positions behind the stone wall, stiff from a night spent on hard ground and jumpy from the occasional crack of a rifle in the distance. The Confederates were still out there, somewhere across Rock Creek, waiting for their moment. Private Eli Baker rubbed his eyes and stretched, wincing as his back protested. He hadn't slept much. How could anyone sleep with the constant fear that a rebel bullet might find its way through the dark? Around him, other soldiers were waking up, grumbling about the cold, the damp, and the lack of breakfast. "Another fine day in paradise," muttered Corporal Amos Reed as he gnawed on a piece of hardtack that looked like it had been baked during the Revolution. "Quit your whinin'," Sergeant Nathaniel Carter growled, though he was chewing his own hardtack with all the enthusiasm of a man eating gravel. "You'll get something better when we're done here, if you live that long." "Comfortin' as always, Sarge," Reed replied with a smirk. The men didn't have long to dwell on their meager rations or Carter's grim humor. By mid-morning, Confederate sharpshooters began firing sporadically from across Rock Creek. The Union soldiers ducked behind their stone wall as bullets smacked into rocks and thudded into tree trunks. Eli crouched low, his musket ready but his hands steady this time. He wasn't as green as he'd been yesterday. Not that he felt like a veteran yet, but at least he knew what to expect. "Here we go again," Carter muttered as he peered over the wall. "Keep your heads down and your powder dry." The Confederates weren't launching a full attack. It was more of the same probing skirmishes they'd seen the night before. But this time, they seemed more determined to push closer to the Union line. Neill's brigade responded with volleys of musket fire whenever they caught sight of gray uniforms moving through the trees. At one point, a group of Confederate sharpshooters managed to take up a position on higher ground near Spangler's Spring, where they could fire down on the Union troops with deadly accuracy. General Neill quickly ordered detachments from the 7th Maine and 43rd New York to drive them off. Eli found himself among those sent forward to reinforce the picket line near the spring. The terrain was rough, thick woods and rocky ground that made it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. The men moved cautiously, their muskets at the ready, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a shot cracked out from the trees ahead, and one of the men near Eli cried out and fell to the ground clutching his leg. The rest of them dropped to their knees and returned fire blindly into the woods. "Hold your fire," Carter barked as he crawled forward to join them. "Wait till you see something worth shooting at." The Confederates were well hidden among the trees and rocks, but eventually Eli spotted movement, a flash of gray cloth, and fired. This time, he didn't flinch at the recoil or hesitate to reload. He wasn't sure if he hit anything, but at least he'd done his part. The skirmish near Spangler's Spring lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Union troops finally managed to drive off the Confederate sharpshooters after several tense exchanges of gunfire. Eli's heart was pounding by the time it was over, but he felt a small surge of pride when Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for a farm boy," Carter said with a rare grin. By late morning, it became clear that Stuart's Confederate brigade wasn't going to break through Neill's line anytime soon. The rebels began pulling back across Rock Creek under sporadic fire from Union troops who cheered as they watched their opponents retreat. Eli leaned against a tree and let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Think that's it?" he asked Carter. "For now," Carter replied with a shrug, "but don't get too comfortable. There's always something else coming in this war." As noon approached and quiet settled over their sector of the battlefield, Eli couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and unease. They'd held their ground, done their duty, but at what cost? He glanced at some of his comrades tending to wounded men, or staring blankly into space, their faces pale and drawn. General Neill rode along the line later that afternoon, nodding approvingly at his men as they stood at attention, or tried to, given their exhaustion. "Well done," Neill said simply as he passed by. It wasn't much of a speech, but it was enough for Eli and the others who had fought so hard to hold this forgotten corner of Gettysburg. As evening fell and news began trickling in about Pickett's charge and other dramatic events elsewhere on the battlefield, Eli realized something. No one would write songs or stories about what happened here on this little stretch of ground near Rock Creek. But that didn't matter, not really. They'd done their job, and sometimes that was enough.